Washington has just crossed the line. Despite the Trump-Xi meeting meant to ease tensions, the United States imposed a 145% tariff on China. Markets around the world held their breath, anticipating a shockwave. But behind this move lies not strength but desperation. With supply chains slipping out of control and allies wavering, Washington has almost no leverage left. The administration is already discussing a new level of pressure. Tariffs up to 500% if Beijing does not yield. In Beijing, silence does not mean surrender. China is preparing a counterstrike with far more powerful tools than tariffs, rare earth metals, the unseen backbone of the modern economy. These elements power smartphones, electric vehicles, and fighter jets, and nearly half of their reserves are under Chinese control. When this supply chain is threatened, the entire global economy shudders. Meanwhile, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is frantically trying to assemble an anti-China coalition. But even America's closest allies depend on Chinese materials. Amid growing tensions, investors are fleeing to safe haven assets. Gold has already hit a historic high, surpassing $4,200 per ounce. Everything happening now has the power to overturn global trade and the balance of power itself. Trump's new tariff is the sharpest move in years, signed suddenly at night, bypassing Congress. The White House called it protection for American industry, but the numbers tell a different story. Last year, imports from China still totaled $427 billion from microchips and batteries to medical equipment. Now nearly all of that flow faces a wall of costs. Markets reacted instantly. Logistics companies halted shipments. Factories in California and Texas warned off rising expenses, and chains like Walmart and Home Depot began raising prices. Goldman Sachs estimates that these tariffs could add about 0.6 percentage points to inflation in the coming months, hitting consumers long before manufacturers can adapt. Even U.S. are alarmed as their own goods often depend on Chinese components moving through American supply chains. In Beijing, shock quickly gave way to calculation. The Ministry of Commerce called Washington's actions economic sabotage. Behind the scenes, officials began preparing a far more subtle response. Instead of symmetric tariffs, China focused on its main advantage, rare earth metals. Controlling half of the world's reserves and about 90% of processing capacity, Beijing can strike where it hurts the most, in high-tech production. Washington talks about reviving its own mining, but experts warned that building a full supply chain from scratch will take decades and trillions of dollars. Therefore, the new tariffs hit not only China, but the United States itself. The show of force quickly turns into a race against time as Beijing quietly transforms the materials that underpin the modern world into weapons of economic war. This uncertainty revealed what markets have long suspected. Washington has almost no leverage left, while Beijing's influence runs far deeper. And the source of that influence is a resource the United States simply cannot replace: rare earth metals. These 17 elements with obscure names are essential to modern life. They're used in electric vehicles, wind turbines, smartphones, and rockets. Without them, the high-tech world simply stops. China controls this industry like no other country controls any resource. China holds 38 to 40% of the world's reserves, but the key is processing. Nearly 90% of all global production passes through Chinese factories. This dominance was built over decades. While other countries closed facilities due to costs and environmental concerns, China invested billions in mining and recycling. Now those investments yield strategic dividends. According to the European Commission, Germany receives 91% of processed rare earths from China, the United Kingdom 89%, South Korea about 80%, Japan 58%. The United States, despite grand plans for diversification, still imports more than 70% directly or through third countries. The remaining major reserves are concentrated in China's partner countries, BRICS, Brazil, India, and Russia. Together, they control almost all significant undeveloped deposits. China does not need to fully ban exports to create panic. Delays in licenses or quotas are enough to send prices soaring. This happened in 2010, when Beijing slightly tightened control. Global prices jumped 700% in just a few months. Today, analysts warned that even if a product contains only 0.1% Chinese rare earths, Beijing already has the legal and strategic right to influence supply. Against the backdrop of broken supply chains and rising costs, this quiet battle over resources is becoming the real front line of the global economic war. China is the largest trading partner for more than 120 countries and accounts for about 15% of world exports. Europe alone imports nearly 600 billion of Chinese goods annually, and Japan and South Korea rely on China for more than a third of critical minerals and electronic components. Even India, considered anally in Washington, buys nearly 30% of its imported equipment and pharmaceutical ingredients from China. Demanding that these countries abandon China is effectively asking them to strike their own economies. Scott Bessent's latest move stunned even America's allies. In an attempt to increase pressure on Beijing, he directly linked Chinese trade with Russia to American sanctions. A 500% tariff on China is not just an extreme measure, it is economic suicide. Such ASTEP would destroy global supply chains and collapse the US economy literally within minutes, while simultaneously bringing Beijing and Moscow even closer together. Washington's logic is clear: cut off Moscow's oil revenue and force China to choose a side. But this strategy is full of contradictions. China has no intention of stopping its purchases of Russian oil. On the contrary, it gives China a huge advantage in production, especially in the midst of a trade war. China currently buys about 2.22 million barrels of Russian oil per day, nearly 40% more than a year ago, and has already become Russia's main energy client. These supplies are not decreasing. On the contrary, they are increasing. Most transactions now go through yuan-based systems or local banking swaps, completely bypassing the dollar. Trump claimed that India had agreed to stop buying Russian oil, presenting it as a diplomatic victory. But the numbers tell a different story. According to Reuters, India still imports about 1.7 million barrels per day with an increasing share of payments in yuan rather than dollars. The share of Russian oil in Indian imports has grown from 2% to approximately 35% since the start of the war in Ukraine. A discount of $5 to $7 off Brent makes Russian oil too profitable to abandon. While Washington talks tough, both China and India are strengthening energy ties with Moscow. For Russia, this means stable revenue. For China, cheap fuel for its factories. For India, strategic independence. Together, they are quietly rewriting the global oil map outside the dollar system and beyond American influence. This is where the real threat to the US economy begins. Gold has soared above $4,200 per ounce, rising more than 5% in just 1 week. This is the fastest increase since the pandemic. It all started after Trump's tariff shock. But the real surge came when markets realized the consequences. More inflation, more uncertainty, and more money printing to soften the blow. Investors are fleeing to safe assets en masse, and gold has once again become the main refuge. Global demand is breaking records. According to the World Gold Council, central banks purchased more than 1,100 tons in 2024, the highest in modern history. The leaders are China, India, and Turkey. These countries are reducing dependence on the dollar and accumulating physical gold. What is happening now is not just another trade clash. It is a global reset of power. The United States can still print money, but it can no longer print resources and trust, which once underpinned its currency. In a world where value is determined by real assets and new alliances, those who control